Chapter 11. It is the first day of training. I stick a tentative foot through the stirrup and focus on the herder's bushy mustache. As I prepare to pull myself up, gripping the pony's wrinkled mane, I remind myself it is just a horse. A solid, four-legged, hairy, plant-eating, sometimes domesticated mammal with a mane and a tail. Yet my breath is scared. I felt more fear in that cold-blooded moment than I would at any point in the race. I didn't show it. I was attached to my exterior of fearlessness. Even inside my head, I never went near phrases such as, I am scared, I am sad, or I am angry. Perhaps this failure to emotionally engage linked me to the long tradition of British adventurers who refused to let anything flummox them, even if their partner's leg fell off in the Arctic. I imagine this sort of disconnection from emotion was also required by their contemporaries and forebears when running an often brutal empire. Somehow, I cannot separate myself from that history. The pony was tiny, yet standing at his side, I felt the cumulative danger of all the risky times I'd ever experienced with horses. I had been led to believe Mongolian ponies were especially life threatening, despite standing half asleep on the horse's line. They were rarely handled and therefore hypersensitive to human motion. If you are lucky to get on board, you would, I'd been told, certainly have no control thenceforth. The right to buck off a human being is one of what I think of as the universal horse rights. Competitors had broken bones from such treatment at past training camps. Years earlier, I myself had broken my collarbone off a horse named Tweenie, whose sensational buck had her known locally as the Witch, a label I loved her for. The pony did not move when I mounted. It turned out the start camp horses had been tamed to prevent a repeat of the previous year's injuries. Choo, choo, said the herder, using the equivalent of a cowboy's giddy up. My pony fell into a donkey trot. Riding is a dance that demands each muscle in your body to answer to an ever-shifting floor. If you speak the language of trot, you will know it as the least graceful of pony paces. I rose up and down to the jarring rhythm, my vision underlined by a pair of triangular ears. If there is a grandeur associated with horseback riding, there was none here. Crawling around the basin aboard our short legged ponies, we thrust our chests outwards, and with every rising stride, the giant, non committal landscape erased us. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, I stooped through the door at the at the end of the row. Soft spoken Patty and four others were already roosting on low beds, indulging in yet another lycra discussion. Matthias, a 40-year-old who lay with his headlamp glowing, muttered in his German accent, I don't wear dry fit clothes. After 3 days, I start to feel like a sausage. I fell asleep to the noises of a party in full tilt. Someone stumbled in after midnight and collapsed next to me, snoring menacingly. From the outline of a beard, I decided it had to be Todd, who herded cattle in Australia for a living and smoked a lot of cigarettes. The next morning, Natasha cheerfully repeated the pleas of an Australian voice she had overheard behind her tent in the night. Look, listen, I love your bum, I love your boobs, and I fucking love your personality. Now, just hurry up and sleep with me. He was talking, Natasha suspected, to one of the vets, who did not sound keen on his advances. At dawn on the second training day, I got entangled in my backpack, which required the rescue of three crew members, including a thick-set, heavily eyebrowed man in his early 30s called Charles. The test pony then sprang me over the plain with weathered resolve. but the saddlebag soon fell off, causing him to have a bucking fit. I jumped off before he threw me. Beneath the pony's tummy, I sat untying the bag from his upper back leg, as though this were my beach spot and he my parasol. My tent mates abandoned me in the hurry to reach the training checkpoint, and Richard, the official race photographer, drove across the plain to magnify his view of my situation. He muttered from his Jeep window as he pulled up, an easy smile behind his words. I mumbled back, "No, I don't know where to go. I can't read my GPS. Is it the pink line or the blue line or the red dot? What's that arrow? Me? Really?" I had been expecting, and I am still expecting, someone to teach me how to use a global positioning system. Although there are many maps of Mongolia, there are no suitable GPS maps at the time of the race. I like the idea of traversing a space free of the net of lines I associated with maps. The organizers had entered the coordinates of the horse changing stations into our GPS systems, but no one had mentioned what the numbers and colors meant. I often feel strange in groups, overwhelmed by the puzzle of humans. So I was moping at the back when the next lot of riders decided to take a deliciously straight line over the rocky ridge. Like a good sheep, I went after them, ignoring the alternative track skirting the mountain. At the top, my horse refused to descend. Like the last lot, the others went on without me. Marooned on the peak, I dismounted and slung my body down on the stone crumble. I wasn't aware of any rules for the training day, so, relieved from the group hurry, I began dozing. In this state, I occasionally returned to the problem at hand, erupting in a spate of giggles. I hadn't noticed until now that part of me preferred to travel slowly and catastrophically. Nor had I realized this preference would be at odds with the participating in a race. Later, I would learn that Devon, the well prepared American competitor, was by now already back at camp, bulging her eyes out of her skull at the news of our group so stupidly going over the ridge. When I was 16, my favorite history teacher told me to start taking myself seriously. I loved her, so I tried to listen, but I didn't understand people who took things seriously. I especially loathed the head girl team, who flapped their wings like mother hens and moved the school corridors with gravity. I couldn't see why you would invest in life in this fashion. How did serious people fare when the world turned around to surprise them? Hours later, I returned to find Devon holding court on the grass. When she announced she was taking bids from people to ride with her, Tom, a tall, blond 24-year-old American, casually said he might like to join Team Devon. She looked him up and down from her sacred patch of land. Sure, if he can keep up. By the next morning, Tom would have torn ligaments in his shoulder, not at the hands of Devon, but because he'd had the pluck to take on a Mongolian in a nighttime wrestling match. The fact that wrestling was a national sport in Mongolia had not been noted by Tom, a risk analyst by trade. What foresight Devon seemed to have. My own race plans were vested in a 6-meter bungee rope I had nabbed on eBay. During nights spent in the open, I would tie it from my tummy to the pony's bridle to stop the pony from straying. None of the other riders believed I was serious about sleeping attached to a wild horse. They thought I'd just end up being dragged down a flinted valley and deposited in a bog. It was during such conversations that I felt myself falling into their stereotypes of an English eccentric. Class B, ditzy, female. None of them were aware that I affected similar surprise back home. At the end of the first training day, a rider from California had asked if I was high, while another had simply inquired after watching me clown about with a little boy. Who's your mother? I sank back into my heart. Once again, I ate lunch besides Patty, who narrowed his eyes and leant into me to reveal his bet on Matthias, the German with no tolerance for dry fits, as a likely winner of the race. Uh, this Matthias, oof, he's a real interesting guy. You know what? What? He lowered his voice. My money's on him to win. Matthias and Patty had decided to ride together. For hours that morning, they flustered about the gloomy Gur, packing and repacking their luggage. Matthias epitomized the winning expert, but without Devin's swagger. He did Tai Chi before breakfast, both training mornings. Had apparently lost 26 kilograms before the race. Riders weren't allowed to weigh more than 85 kilograms or 187 pounds in their gear, and had clocked up over 6,000 kilometers on lone training rides in the Australian outback with his GPS. I had never ridden more than 20 kilometers at once, let alone with a GPS. And as established, I didn't know how to use one anyway. On the eve of the race, we ate a sacrificed sheep. The smell of his blood still hung about in the air when I sidled up to Devon Horn to find out a little more. She was a gap that needed filling. I'd been circling around her in conversations all day. I found her facing away from the fire with her arms crossed. She answered my queries, looking straight at me, the firelight flickering up around her rounded cheeks. She was studying criminology at the third best school for criminology in the US and had grown up in Austin, Texas. She was on the US National Endurance Riding Team and only 20 years old. She asked me no questions. The conversation concluded with silence. An American film crew from ABC had arrived earlier that afternoon to make a documentary of the Derby. They quickly discovered Devon's bravado and took wide angled shots of her staring at the horizon in her slick purple sunglasses, the wind mopping her hair and jostling the grasses behind her. What's the plan? You gonna win this thing? She looked at the interviewer, deadpan. Universe, move out of the way. Behold, Devon Horn, endurance rider from the West. Yes. What had we all missed by not growing up in Texas? I think the rest of us understood. We, too, needed faith in the race and in ourselves. But we were under the impression that we would need just as much doubt, since the odds were against us. Could envisaging victory or foretelling any story make it come true? Well, what if the race had already happened in all our preparatory thoughts and words, and we're simply now going to receive it? I hummed my way back to that Gur, where Patty and Matthias were in mad rabbit mode, flinging discarded headlamps and Mongolian phrase books over their shoulders. They had come lathered in death prevention equipment, but needed now to minimize their luggage weight. Theirs was a very professional paranoia, one that rendered most alternative attitudes naive. I slid into bed and wrote in my Winnie the Pooh notebook, feeling I was no match for their good middle age and doubled up mapping systems. Matthias soon interrupted our sleep to announce he felt very smelly. I lifted my head to check if his words were real. His legs were sprawled off the end of his mattress. Why do you smell? I added. It's all the carbs I've been eating at this base camp, he sighed, making me really stinky. Minutes later, he let out a prolonged equine groan.